And we are live now. All right. There we go. Looks good. It appears to be streaming on both locations, which is, again, to the good. Just really quick, get the link shared around to a few folks. Share the link, copy the URL. Because I'm not dealing with a great laptop, I'm doing this sharing of the link separately on the phone. Because I am, again, something of a tech neophyte. I don't know what I'm doing. Boop. There we go. And we'll do this. Wow. It's a lot of notices. Oh, okay. Boop, boop. Paste that. And groups. There we go. Talking books. Go, paste that. There we go. Let's see if they like that. And we'll see about that. All right, good enough. Now, hold on a second. One more. There we go. Now it's good enough. All right. Should probably be done with the setup phase. Otherwise, it's just kind of dead air on screen. And no one is going to enjoy that. Holy crap, almost 2.5 minutes of quiet / almost dead air. Greetings and salutations, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to the Storyteller's Corner. I'm your host, Joshua T. Calkins-Trubergy, also known as Byron Sidious, and also known on Substack.com as the Storyteller's Corner.substack.com. That's where you can head to in order to keep up with the ongoing fiction presentations from yours truly, as well as some written essays and some audio essays regarding bookish things and occasionally popular culture observations with regards to the current state of things like video games and socio-political events and news items. I don't delve into that frequently because that's not my particular wheelhouse. My particular wheelhouse is books and bookish things, specifically genre fiction. If we're going to get down into the nitty-gritty, I tend to lean towards focusing on fantasy, horror, and science fiction. I am not as much of a science fiction storyteller as I am a reader of sci-fi. I tend to focus primarily on fantasy and horror as an author. Began my writing career much more focused on fantasy with a couple of horror short stories here and there. And the balance has now kind of gone from fantasy horror to fairly equivalent as time has gone by and as I have grown much more cynical about my particular perspective on the world and the goings on therein. So let's take a quick look at some information brought by an outlet known as Fast Company. They cover various business-related topics, and they focused recently on Barnes & Noble bookstores. Barnes & Noble bookstores, since about 2018, has been slowly but surely shuttering locations nationwide as their market has not quite collapsed, but certainly fallen out from under their feet. They saw a long period of declining sales, particularly with the advent and rise of streaming video services like Netflix, Hulu, things like Tubi and Pluto TV. And there's one other one that I'm not going to name because they don't deserve your money or attention these days based on the crap programming that they're throwing out there. So you have a lot of folks who have been roped into just passively watching uh, their entertainment, not engaging with books. And we've seen this happening for decades. It's not an uncommon thing. Readership, generally speaking, is on the decline across most American or Western world markets. However, since approximately 2022, there's been a slow resurgence as people have also returned to wanting to get away from the only two locations most of us spend the vast majority of our time in, at work and at home. I've touched upon this subject briefly in an essay about 6 or 7 months ago, talking about third places and the decline or disappearance of third places. This was especially hard hit during the COVID-19 pandemic of late 2019 and throughout the calendar year of 2020 and 2021. The elimination of third places, the utter brutalization and shutdown of places of gathering that are not our workplaces or our homes, places like bars, like social clubs, cafes, libraries, even public parks, what have you. Many of the third places that we relied upon to gather together with our fellow man, woman, whoever, we saw them kind of wiped out, and many of them did not recover when the pandemic emergency was rescinded, when we were allowed to get back to our normal everyday lives prior to, in the state, prior to everybody losing their ever loving minds. The third place got kneecapped. One such third place that has always been popular with folks who are a little bit more of the academic or thoughtfully bent have been libraries and bookstores. Now, Barnes and Noble is one of the largest one of the largest chain book retailers in the world. They are extremely prevalent here in the United States. We don't have Waterstones like they have in the UK, in Scotland, in Ireland, in Wales, um, and in many other places in Europe, including Germany. But we do still have Barnes and Noble, and over the course of 6 or 7 years, they saw their locations one by one slowly shuttering when they could not generate enough revenue or traffic to justify their continued operations. However, last year, Barnes and Noble was able to open 37 brand new locations. Well, they're not all brand new last year. What was it? 8 of those locations were reopenings of previously established locations. Barnes and Noble this year has plans and is on track to open 60 new stores. To be clear, not all of them are brand new. 48 of the locations are brand new. They're new leases on properties that have since been abandoned by other retailers, many of them Best Buy outlets or former Target locations. Some of the smaller non-superstore locations, they're being refitted to be Barnes and Noble stores. 12 of the locations that Barnes and Noble is going to be opening this year are reopenings. Now, of those 12, only 2 of them were shuttered in the last 2 years. The rest were previously shuttered at some point between 2014 and 2024. So 10 of the locations are going to be returning to operations that they had been absent from. Their leases had been up and they'd been gone away for several years. This is going to generate either interest in people who used to work for Barnes and Noble booksellers, returning to a place that they formerly loved going to work every day, people who were passionate about literature, about reading, about literacy, about the art of the written word. And those kinds of folks, quite frankly, I know there's a lot of them who are going to be looking at seeing themselves going to a workplace that does not necessarily pay the best wages. But many of the folks who choose to work in such locations anyway, they're doing so because they see a benefit that is not tied solely to their paycheck. Um, so that is quite brilliant. Many of the new locations that will be opening are referred to as fast concept. These are smaller locations. They're only going to focus on hosting top sellers and best sellers, which is kind of, I give a little bit of a boo hiss. Approximately 24 of these locations will be fast concept, meaning they'll be small, tiny kind of hole in the wall outlets. They're only going to be stocking or shelving very popular books that are chart from USA Today bestsellers lists or New York Times bestsellers lists or the Amazon bestseller listings. That takes a little bit of my joy away in Barnes and Noble's resurgence. But yeah, sure, I'm not like jumping for joy that they're going to be focusing so hard on only bestsellers, but it's something. And it's getting books back in front of people and returning to prominence the idea that you can spend your entertainment dollars and time, which is a resource far more valuable than the retail cost of many books. You're getting a return on your investment that I personally believe is far more valuable than sitting down in front of a subscription streaming service and turning half of your brain off in order to watch some kind of pointless digital slop that any one of these streaming services serves up in front of you, whether it be Paramount Plus or what used to be known as HBO Max, now it's just called Max, or Shudder. Much as I love them because they do horror, it's kind of a half useless service most times, and there's a reason why I canceled my subscription. Um, I had Shudder for half a year, and I decided, well, I've watched pretty much everything that I want to, and they're not getting a whole lot of anything new or worthwhile. If something else comes along that I'm interested in, I'll wait until they have a back catalog, maybe between 10 to 12 new features or limited series. I'll resubscribe. I'll burn through them in a month, and then I'll cancel the subscription again. They'll have gotten their money, and I'll have gotten my worth out of it. Anyway, that's aside from the point I'm trying to aim at. Booksellers are seeing something of a mild resurgence nationally in the United States, and I would say in the UK, but bookstores never really saw as heavy a drop off as they saw here in the States. The UK has, generally speaking, been a lot more supportive of booksellers and bookstores and reading as a pastime than we have seen here in the States. I assume, just from observation, that it's culturally more relevant for folks who reside in the UK to have access to books and to booksellers. Here in the States, we tend to be far more concentrated and concerned with what's on television, what can we watch. And with the rise also of podcasts and podcasting, a lot of our material that we take in for entertainment doesn't just come in visually through film or television. We're also listening to it audibly on services like Spotify or iTunes podcasts and what have you. There's also a number of podcasts that are hosted on YouTube and Rumble that, yes, there is a visual element, but really you don't have to be watching the show. You can just listen to it and get just as much out of it as if you were looking at the screen. You can listen in and be engaged in doing some other activity, whether it be driving to work, driving home from work, running errands, what have you. As long as you are listening in, you're taking in the material. But according to Fast Company, again, which is a news outlet, digital news outlet. Part of the reason that we are seeing this return to prominence of bookstores amongst folks who have been interviewed about why they are returning to bookstores, or what brought them to Barnes and Noble, or what brought them to Half Price Books or Books a Million or what have you. A lot of people have been saying, according to Fast Company, that they have reached a point of streaming burnout. They are not satisfied with the programming on offer on their various streaming subscription services. I can't say as I'm shocked. Most original programming on places like Paramount or Netflix, Hulu, the other one that is completing the purchase of Hulu, Max, what have you. A lot of the original programming is kind of garbage tier material. Not all of it is entertaining. A lot of it is ideologically ham-fisted. Much of it is derivative, or it's a remake or a rehash or a reboot or a sequel. A lot of folks are just, they're getting tired of getting the same garbage thrown in front of them and paying a consistent monthly subscription fee for something that they either don't care about or that just doesn't really fit their desires and needs as someone partaking of entertainment when they have leisure time. Most folks who are working a full-time job and have any degree of responsibilities outside of work and paying their bills, if you've got children, if you're alone, or if you're single and you've just got hobbies, or you have to do some kind of maintenance or upkeep on your home, whether it be a rented apartment, a rented house, a rented townhome, whatever. Most folks don't enjoy a tremendous deal of leisure or downtime nowadays. There's also the increasing focus and kind of attention paid to people utilizing every moment of their day to try and have a side hustle, find another way to earn more money, have a second job, whether it be a gig job or a second part-time job. This is not just because people want more money. It's also because, I don't know if you've been paying attention to the last few years economically, but most of us are strapped against the wall. We need the extra income because economically we have been beaten over the heads for the last 4 or 5 years. Many of us have very little leisure time to actually spend sat down with a good book. When we do have leisure time, we're mentally fried. We don't have the available RAM to spend sitting down and partaking of theater of the mind. And that can really make it difficult to enjoy a book if you're not able to disengage from everything and feel as though you are in a relaxed place where you can take your frame of mind and settle it into another place, at least for the length of time that you are focusing between the covers of that book. But a lot of people are getting burned out on the digital offerings on streaming. So they are returning to that oldest of pastimes, reading. I, for one, am partial toward that. I'm perfectly good with that. And I hope people will return more frequently to reading. As a matter of fact, I would recommend that if folks are looking for a new read, well, newer, they may consider going and checking out, available at Barnes & Noble on their website, The Big Tour, the tale of Daryl Steele, a heavy metal roadie since he was a young man, who has decided that he's going to get himself attached to a metal band known as the New Horsemen. And he's been working with the New Horsemen for some time. And he is a loyal and capable roadie chief, kind of their captain of the roadies. And he's enjoying living that lifestyle and doing that work. Sadly for Daryl, band has decided they're going to go on one last big tour from coast to coast, from Los Angeles to New York City. And well, as the loyal roadie chief, Daryl understands why they're calling it, they're hanging it up. They're going on one last big tour. But the band needs Daryl's help. Because you see, they've got very special instruments that they're going to be playing at these tour dates and locations. And after the second show, somebody steals these very important instruments from the band. And they are quite frazzled because they need those instruments for their plans for the tour. They need to play these instruments at the end of each show. You see, they've got these special horns, these trumpets that they'll be blowing at the end of each show in order to call down Armageddon. But these are not simply a band known as the Horsemen. They are the Horsemen. And they need their crew chief to help them do one last tour, the big one. That is The Big Tour by yours truly, Joshua T. Calkins Trilogy. It is available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. There's a couple of copies available on thriftbooks.com as well. If you're interested in that sort of a weird dark fantasy heavy metal mashup, then I would recommend that you head on over there and grab yourself a copy. So I've done the shameless plug. Let's get back to the primary material. So there is a kind of a renaissance coming to us for third places. People want to return to a third place. They don't want to be stuck in either home or their workplace. And as we become more social again, as we try to reconnect with one another as Americans and as just everyday normal human beings, we need to have a third place to go to gather, to have conversations, to socialize. And there are a few options that we have available to us. There's the gym, sports club. There's places like Games Workshop, game stores. And then there's libraries, cafes, and the bookstore. So bookstores are enjoying that resurgence. It's slow but steady. But as with anything in the publishing and bookish realm, slow but steady tends to be how these things operate. And there's no qualms with that. Again, publishing has been around for a very, very long time, and hopefully it will remain that way. Knock off Dr. Pepper. I, for one, am glad to see even a large-scale chain store like Barnes & Noble have the chance to come back to prominence. Sadly, however, niche bookstores are also on the rise. Now, I say sadly, but it's not really that sad. I am a niche guy. All right, I focus primarily on fantasy, horror, and sci-fi. If there are bookstores coming out that specifically cater to that audience, awesome. And if there's one that ever opens up in my area, they've got themselves a long-time or long-term customer. If you look at my bookshelves here in my office, I have a tendency to lean towards fantasy and sci-fi in my reading material. I don't have a whole lot of horror titles on hand right now. Most of my horror is digital. It's on my Kindle. Or on my Samsung tablet. But if they have such a niche location, they've got a customer in me. However, most of the niche stores that are popping up nationwide here in the States are focused on specifically romance genre literature, thanks to the book talk phenomenon. Most of the folks who became quote unquote book influencers on TikTok, these people who refer to themselves as the subculture of book talk, most of them are female readers, most of them are women, focusing on romance and fantasy romance or sci-fi romance or supernatural romance. The entire genre of fantasy is drowning in romance fantasy hybridization. Every other book coming out that features fey creatures has some primary protagonist who is a young woman who is either inadvertently or unknowingly a member of some kind of fey lineage who gets wrapped up in the supernatural realm or the fairy realm and has to either find their one true love or it's saccharine shit. Most of it is garbage tier writing. A lot of it, unfortunately, my wife enjoys that stuff. And I've asked her a few times, hey, do you mind if I just read a couple of pages? You can always go back to your spot on your Kindle. And without fail, 5 of the 5 times that she's let me read just a few pages from any of these fey romance fantasy novels that she has been reading over the course of the last year, 5 out of 5 times, it's garbage tier writing. Piss poor syntax, no characterization beyond, the primary lead female being very dewy-eyed and awe-inspired by her unbeknownst powers awakening. Ugh. It's the same tropes done over and over again, ham-fistedly, with no sense of technique or nuance or differentiation to make them stand out from one another, other than a few names and details being changed and shifted around. She is reading the same regurgitated slop from one author to another. And by the way, every single title she has read over the course of the last year was written and published by a female author. She hasn't read a book from a male author in probably 3 or 4 years. This is the trend in publishing right now, especially in genre fiction literature. If you want a snowball's chance in hell of getting a fantasy title published that is not self-produced, you'd better be a woman or have a female pen name. Otherwise, you're dead. It's not happening for you. But that's a whole other screed. Sorry about that. But of the 70 niche bookstores that are going to be opening this year alone, according to Nielsen Bookscan, 44 of them specifically target romance novels and romance readers and audiences. So, of the 70 specialist bookstores, one of them is a chain store that's referred to as Love Struck Books. They're going to be opening 4 different locations nationwide, one in New York, one in specifically Manhattan. Where are my notes here? Here we go. One in Manhattan, one in Los Angeles, one in Seattle, and one in Miami. So 4 Love Struck bookstores will be opening specifically targeted to the romance readership. Okay, that's fine. People want to read their romance slop. I am not a particular fan of the genre, but I'm not everybody. Everybody has their own tastes. And if these booksellers are niche, they are going to create more demand for more books. Okay, I can get behind that. I'm not a huge fan of what they're focusing on. And it seems to be lending towards this ongoing trend that we've seen over the course of the last 20 or 30 years, where most of the market is dominated by female authors, by feminine lead protagonists, published by books that are published by outlets that are seeking to capitalize on the fact that most people who are buying books are female, young adult. They have disposable income, and they are opting to spend a chunk of that disposable income on fantasy romance novels. Many of those books written at a young adult audience range and capacity, or middle grade. I talked about this last week in my stream, that the vast majority of adult women in the United States are reading at a barely 10th grade level back in 1990. The reading comprehension skills and level of 10th graders in 1990, not current day 10th graders. Because current day 10th graders, on a sliding scale, have the same reading comprehension capacity, again, according to the American Literacy Project, of 7th graders from 1990. We have seen literacy rates and capability sliding down because we don't focus on reading comprehension. We're not just asking people, can you tell me the broader themes of the book? We want to know, can you identify tropes? Can you identify how they are utilized? Can you identify the nuances of metaphor versus simile? Can you identify the proper utilization of adjectives and when they are excessively used? Do you need to utilize 6 or 7 different adverbs before you get to the action in a sentence, or can you simply use a singular descriptor and move on? Most people are incapable of displaying these skills anymore. Reading comprehension has nosedived into the toilet in the United States, and it is deeply concerning to somebody like myself who wants to see people be able to return to reading books as a pastime, but also maintaining the capacity to actually differentiate between what is solid writing and what is popular market slop. Do you know why we don't get a whole lot of great television or programs or films anymore? Most TV and film projects are predicated on books and short stories. They're based on previously established intellectual property and material. If you've got absolute garbage tier slop filling the marketplace of ideas for your written fiction, which is the most basic form, then what you're going to get in a television adaptation or a film adaptation is garbage tier slop. Unless you've got a screenwriter who is talented beyond belief and can insert some material to make it more meaningful, you're going to be dealing with low grade garbage for a very long time. And I prefer not to see that. Does it mean it's going to change for the better? I don't know. Doesn't seem to be aiming in that direction. I'll be right back, ladies and gentlemen. Gotta hit the loo. about that. Anyhow, yeah, so that's the current state of things in terms of booksellers, bookstores, how those are coming along. Here. Who be messaging me? Oh, that was just okay. That was a general Discord pop. If you hear the beeps or bloops in the background, that is my Discord. I keep it running relatively constantly. Okay. So anyhow, the art of the written word, obviously, is something I care deeply about. Not only as someone who reads a lot and who writes a fair amount, but all entertainment in our modern day is predicated upon the written word. This includes our more technologically advanced forms of entertainment, including video games. Since the days of Pac-Man and Donkey Kong and Pole Position, even Frogger, I've been someone who partakes of video games. I've shown you folks several times my little Datafrog SFC 2000 retro handheld device. That's my primary gaming system these days. I focus mostly on playing retro games. And I have been the fortunate recipient of many recommendations, thanks to just posing the question on several users on my X account. Hey, what would you recommend from the Game Boy or the Game Boy Color? What's a decent platformer or a fun puzzle platformer from the Sega Genesis era? And they'll respond pretty quickly with, "Hey, you should try this out. You should try this out." And I'll look through my my library of games on the Datafrog, and if I've got that game, I'll load it up. I'll start trying it out on a break at work. I've got two 15-minute breaks and a half-hour break at work. The 15-minute breaks, I usually will grab a snack and play a little bit of the Datafrog. My half-hour break, I usually spend these days reading. But I'll play a little bit, 5 or 10 minutes here or there. If I've got a few minutes at home, I'll turn that thing on, play a little bit, quick save, turn it off. It's part of what I love about those handheld retro devices is that they're very, very ideal. They're quite ideal for a quick pick up and play and save it, shut it off, put it down, put it away. Get back to your real life, to what you're supposed to be doing and focusing on. That's why I really enjoy that device. A lot of people bag on it because it's kind of underpowered. It doesn't handle a lot of systems. All the systems it does handle are really old. So what? The games are fun. The other day, I finished playing through Super Mario Land 2, 6 golden coins. There's not much of a story to that game. There just isn't. Mario's manor was taken over, or his castle, or whatever, by some imposter who you all know and hate or love, known as Wario. You had to go through various lands collecting these special coins to unlock the gates around the manor so you could go in and fight Wario and take back his castle. Pretty cut and dry. Pretty simple. But the gameplay loop was so fun. It was really entertaining and engaging. I loved that game. It was great. Nowadays, we have access to far more sophisticated titles. Many of these titles, many of these games, are lengthy and require a certain degree of sophistication in the writing of the storyline and the characters involved in those games. We've seen some really awful writing, some just bog standard characterization and character development throughout the last few years. Games whose entire storylines seem to be aimed at socio-political messaging and ideological browbeating and soapbox sermonizing in the digital realm. Nobody is going to take enjoyment from being told that they're an awful human being. It should come as no surprise then when those titles crash and burn, as recently happened in the case of EA's and slash BioWare's failed Dragon Age The Veilguard. I understand why that game failed because I've watched a number of people play the game on live stream. The characterizations were wooden, artificial, they were forced. Dialogue is unnatural and oftentimes contrived. Contrived in a way that we haven't seen since the Silver Age of Marvel and DC comic books contrived. People don't talk like the characters in these games talk. I ran into this problem when I read through John Della Rosa's For Steam and Country. The characters in that book's manner of dialogue and conversing with one another was so wooden and artificial that it took me out of the moment. There was a scene relatively early on wherein the primary character, the primary protagonist, she was en route from her hometown to a nearby township, and this military officer who she was traveling with and her father's attorney, they were approaching a checkpoint. They stopped the vehicle so that the police, the military officer, Captain Von Cravat, I hate that the names in that book were such garbage, like something out of Tintin. This isn't a cartoon, Mr. Della Rose. It's a fantasy book. What are you doing? Fucking amateur hour. But if you want more on that, you can go check out the video review for that. Anyway, this Captain Von Cravat goes darting off into the woods to avoid being spotted and found at the checkpoint. And our main character says out loud, "Boy, she's really talented and skilled and can obviously move quickly to avoid detection." Who talks like that? No one. No human being, not even any alien in Star Trek, talks that way. Now, obviously, there is the exception of the one fellow from the classic episode who speaks in metaphors or in I can't remember exactly how to put it, but the most famous line from the episode is "Jaffa, when the walls fell." Picard talks to this guy. Basically their entire form of communication is quoting different lines from their species or culture's prior established literature and narratives, their mythology. So every emotional concept they want to get across, they get across in the form of metaphor. Airconda TV Gaming, lurking while working. Well, greetings and salutations to you, and thanks for popping in, Airconda. So it's one of those things where if the dialogue feels as though it could not possibly hit your ear without making you wince at how unnatural it is, that's an example of piss poor writing. And we're getting a lot of that in video games. We're getting a lot of that in television. We're getting a ton of that in film. And we're seeing it in most modern books written at the young adult level. Now, I'm not a huge fan of young adult writing or middle grade writing as it is. So I don't spend a ton of time when I am indulging in leisure time reading of fiction steeped in that realm. I tend to lean more towards adult grade fantasy and horror. So I don't come across a great deal of it. I see some of it in sci-fi, even as much as I like John Ringo and his military spec sci-fi stuff from Baen Publishing or Baen Books. There are characters who speak in a very unnatural fashion in those books as well. In a couple of cases, it's forgivable because they're not human. They're literally other species who their language is translated through devices into common human English, and so the translation's a little clunky. Translation is one area where clunkiness, I throw my hands up and just say, look, that's going to happen. Because whenever you're dealing with trying to extrapolate precise meaning from a language that is not your own native tongue, you're going to have things that trip you up a little bit. For instance, in the Inuit language, there are like 42 different words for snow. Each of those words carries by itself a different set of preconceived notions that describe the type of snow, the texture of snow, the temperature of that particular piece of snow, whether the snow is on the ground or in a tree. They have a bunch of different individual words for snow, but each one carries different connotations to identify what specific type of snow it is. So translating all 42 of those different words into just the word snow, obviously something is being lost in translation. There is something almost beautiful about that. The fact that it's such a common thing for the Inuit peoples to have observed in their day-to-day lives that rather than utilizing adverbs, adjectives, and descriptors to attach to the primary word snow, instead they shorthanded it so that they could wrap up descriptor and material, primary component, snow itself, with its descriptors into a singular term so that with the utterance of a single word, they could convey a great deal of meaning. This is similar to the concept in photography or in art that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Yes, it is. What's more difficult, though, is finding somebody who's willing and able to put together those 1,000 words or more to describe a picture. It's why television, film, and video games, in part why, as time has gone on, they've become more and more popular with audiences because you're able to convey a great deal more information and material into a shorter span of time. However, much like when dealing with translating from one language to another, when you are translating from one medium to another, something is invariably going to be lost in translation. Another fine example that most folks will be familiar with if they are fans of fantasy, as I am, is Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings film trilogy. Even the director's cut, extended versions of those films do not incorporate or encompass everything that is crammed into the books, The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers, and Return of the King. For instance, you don't have Tom Bombadil at all. He's a non-factor in the films, even the extended versions. There's the element of the Westerlings who never make, or sorry, the Easterlings who never make an appearance in the films, even the extended versions. The secondary conflicts on the fields of Rohirrim, you don't see any of that, even in the expanded versions. Something gets lost in translation due to constraints of the medium. In the case of adapting a book to a film, you're having to deal with the constraints of actors, you're having to deal with aging, with certain actors not being available or getting injured or dying. You're also dealing with the confines and constraints of physical props and property, being able to film on location, making certain that it's all clear for your crew to put together and film the actual movie. You're then having to contend with there is no such thing as an actual orc or urukai, so you have to use either practical effects makeup or computer-generated special effects to create the visual that in a book, you just need a couple of paragraphs. It's pretty cheap considering the cost of ink and paper. Much more affordable. Um, I'm being a little facetious there, but it is a genuine observation that you don't have to worry about so many of the physical constraints in entertainment when it's in the written form. If you're doing a film or you're doing a television show, an adaptation, you have to work within the constraints of physical capacity and budget. In a video game, you're not so much constrained about what you can do visually if you've got powerful enough software and talented enough developers and programmers to render on screen visually and audibly what you want to see. Whatever you can imagine, you can produce on screen. Some amazing creature design can be found in things like Bloodborne or in Elden Ring and Dark Souls and Capcom versus Marvel, all the Mega Man games. If you can imagine it, it has been in a video game more than likely audio visually because you don't have as many constraints on what you're able to do, with the exception of the capacity of the hardware or software to render a visual. Obviously, we've seen great leaps and bounds of improvement and evolution from the days of the Atari 2600 when you've got Jumpman hopping over flaming barrels thrown by a giant disgruntled gorilla who kidnapped his girlfriend, as opposed to nowadays we can see Mario in full 3D, completely rendered, each little hair on his weird push broom mustache flapping in the wind as he jumps and hops and turns into a catsuit weird claw thing. There have been advancements and enhancements, obviously. But it all boils down, once again, to are you working with quality material to begin with? Is there something here that is worth engaging with? In the area of video games, you don't necessarily have to have a complicated plot in order to have a fun game. We know that from puzzle games. We know that from the early action adventure titles. It doesn't necessarily have to be a deeply complex story attached to the game to make it entertaining and amusing and fun. That's more gamish. That's more of your gameplay loop. Is it entertaining? If you do want something more thoughtful, like a role-playing game, like the Dragon Age series was until recently, you have to have characters that aren't wooden, that you can give a shit about, and who aren't insufferable prats. You also have to have a plot that hooks and engages and maintains the interest of the players. If the plot is full of tropes that have been overdone and are poorly handled and have no original twist or kink to them to make them at least somewhat more engaging than your typical slop, then who's going to want to stick around? The answer is probably nobody. Anyway, my point being there. When you do not have quality writing on a video game that requires good writing, you're going to end up with an end product that is low quality. I don't care how good the combat is in an RPG, which I play predominantly for the characters and the story and the world building. That's why I engage with those games, because they are an interactive form of narrative. If you can't give me something worth my time on the writing end, I don't care how fun the combat is. I'll look for a different game that focuses on the combat experience. It's not difficult. There's plenty of them out there. There's a game for the PSP called Undead Night. Terrible plotline. Really hokey. I mean, dead hokey, dark fantasy. Full of tropes that are just poorly put together. But there's barely any focus on the story. Most of the focus is on the gameplay loop. The combat, turning enemy combatants into members of your horde of the undead, throwing their zombie corpses around, or uh, uh, aiming them at different structures to destroy them and rip them apart, or aiming them at larger enemies to circle around and beat into the ground and destroy and dismantle. The gameplay loop, the combat on that game is fun. It's engaging. The story, kind of shit, but I don't care about it because the gameplay is fun. I have access to that game and I can play that at any time. I don't need Dragon Age the Fail Guard, which is supposed to be story driven and character driven. I have heard and seen from a couple people who've streamed the game that the combat system combat and skill system is really streamlined. I don't necessarily want streamlined. I really enjoyed the tactical, more in place and broader skill set availability and the option to control other members of your party that were features of Inquisition. Inquisition was a great game by my metric. Yeah, there were some parts that were a little and so the collision detection and clipping, there were problems. It was a glitchy game. All that aside, the characters in that game were engaging. The plot was okay. I wasn't big a fan of Corypheus as an antagonist. Quite frankly, I find some of the sideline antagonists more interesting. But especially the whole Tevinter thing. But again, I'm sidelining myself. I'm getting distracted. The reason I liked Inquisition was because the writing of the characters and the plot and the world building were engaging, and the gameplay loop was also enjoyable. It all lined up to give me a satisfying experience. Having just watched maybe 6 or 7 hours of people streaming Dragon Age the Veilguard, there's no way I would drop money on that piece of steaming shit. Not just because I'm not a big fan of the visuals. They're okay. They are what they are. I'm not a big fan of the style. But the mechanics look too streamlined for my liking. And if you're not going to give me great gameplay, you had better give me great characters and a fantastic plotline. This game gave neither. It took the concept of Solos, the Dreadwolf, and put him on the back burner. For what? Why? Why allow 10 years of anticipation to build up just to make him a side quest, effectively? Not even the primary focus of the story. What happened? What happened was a bunch of ideologically captured hacks in the writer's room. This is why the more complex an art form gets, the more solid its fundamentals and foundational skill set needs to be. It's much like martial arts. When you begin learning any martial art form, you begin with the foundational basics, learning the proper stance, learning how to hold your hands to the sides, doing a basic block pattern, and going through a basic kata in order to perform the basic motions of that art form. And as you accelerate and gain knowledge and rank in the motions and counter motions of that art form, you grow into complexity. But it's all predicated on solid foundational basic building blocks. The same thing translates over into complex media and entertainment forms. If you don't have solid fundamentals, nothing else matters. The more complicated maneuvers and techniques and tactics that you attempt to employ, if your foundational basics suck, then your more advanced elements are also going to suck. Corinne Bush and the other people at BioWare Montreal who worked on writing the characters and the plot and the world building elements of the Veilguard. They did not have their basic foundational skills in line and in order. They focused more on ideological pandering and ham-fisted messaging, as opposed to figuring out or remembering, oh yeah, we need to build a character here. Now, you don't have to empathize with the character. You don't have to like the character. That is not a key element when creating a solid character in fiction. You don't have to make them likable. They don't have to be your best friend, but they do have to be three-dimensional. There has to be more to them than the one facet of their personality or their life choices. Otherwise, they are a boring, pointless archetype at best, stereotype at worst. It's like Bush and his coven of people working there at BioWare forgot entirely about the hierarchy of character development. There are 4 levels of character when you're building your fiction. There's your stereotype. This is utilized for quick throwaway characters who mean nothing to the plot or the world that you're building. They are quickly disposed of because they only have 1 or 2 lines, or they're barely interacting with the primary or secondary cast in your story, and then they're gone. They're out the door. You can rely on stereotypes when they don't matter. Then your second stage are your principal archetype characters. These are characters who have a little bit more body to them, have a little bit more definition. They may have a few spoken lines. They may show up in several scenes throughout the entirety of your plot, but overall, they don't have a tremendous effect or lasting effect on the overall quality or aim of the narrative you are building. Your archetype characters, typically, who are in the primary archetype variety, are people like your veteran soldier, your veteran town guardsman, or perhaps the lore master of your mages guild. These are characters who they have some fairly standardized kind of trope heavy character traits and aspects, maybe 1 or 2 physical features that you'll see carried over from one example to another, like a trainer who's got like the gash scar over his eye. This is a fairly tropey thing that you're going to find in this type of primary archetypal character. Then you have your complex archetype character, somebody who could be vital to the overall narrative and plot that you're working on. They're also referred to sometimes as a supporting lancer character, where they have more definition. They're almost completely 3-dimensional characters, but they do rely on some trope-like mechanisms to carry them throughout the entirety of the story. And then, lastly, you have your fully committed character. They're not an archetype. They're not a complex archetype. They're not a stereotype. They're a fully realized 3-dimensional person in your fictional setting. Bush and company clearly forgot how to create characters. If you don't have your foundational fundamentals in place, you cannot create something more complex. It will fall apart. It will fail. Period. I wasn't originally intending on going down this road and talking about this, but oh well. But I'm just going to pretty much wrap it for me for today, ladies and gentlemen. Eric Honda, you only popped in once to say hello, that you were lurking while working, but I appreciate you stopping in. And there weren't a whole lot of folks here during the live broadcast. That's okay. There rarely are many folks here. I accept that. I am, for the most part, just a storyteller who's rambling here on Rumble and YouTube, talking about bookish things that it's kind of niche. It's kind of a niche thing. That's okay. It's what I do. Anyhow, ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to read any material that I have available on the Substack, it is, again, available at thestorytellerscorner.substack.com. And once again, if you are looking for a dark fantasy novel to add to your collection, I would recommend hopping on over to barnesandnoble.com or Amazon and grabbing your copy of The Big Tour, especially if you're a metalhead and you enjoy all things dark fantasy. That will be right up your alley. I can almost guarantee it. And Daryl Steele would thank you for the support as well. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. I ask that you take care of yourselves, and as always, keep reading.